This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Good afternoon and welcome to this second session. Can I just remind you that these are mere objects of entertainment and do nothing for your welfare orally. They're defunct, like the dead parrot. They don't work. This session is going to look at East and Central Africa. One of the questions that I think is frequently asked, certainly we asked it when I was a university teacher, teaching in London, teaching African history. The questions such as, during the colonial rule, Africa was mainly governed by Africans. Discuss. And that seems to fit very neatly with what we're here today to look at, indirect rule and indigenous rule on the ground at the grassroots level. And we've got three people who are going to speak, one from Northern Rhodesia background, one from Tanganyika, and one from Uganda, so a cover of East and Central Africa. And first of all, I'm going to ask Andrew Stuart, who worked in Uganda, if he will address us. Thank you,
Andrew. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wow. I think just before we begin, I'd like to say, because I believe it, and I think we all do, how much we welcome this kind of event and the initiative of actually continuing to have these series of discussions. The truth is that the received view of the whole of the British colonial and other colonial experience, which forms the basis of most students' PhD thesis, is that colonialism was nothing but a sham and a cheat and an exploitation. And if we don't stand up and tell it how it was, A, nobody else knows how it was, and B, our experience will be forgotten. So just to begin with, personally, and I'm sure others will agree, I'd like to offer a vote of thanks to the administration for organising this.
Yeah.
When I'm asked to introduce myself in gatherings like this, I usually say Uganda, 1929 to 1965, and involvement thereafter. It's true that when I first arrived in Uganda, I wasn't in a position to know very much about indirect rule. Nevertheless, it does have the advantage that it tends to deter anybody from asking any questions at the end. And for completeness, I should perhaps also say, because I'm talking mainly about Uganda with a sidelight at the New Hebrides, that I was also, during my Foreign Office time, I was the head of the Hong Kong department of the Foreign Office, and I also negotiated the independence of Seychelles. So I have been involved in the decolonization of not one, not two, but 4 different dependent territories, which perhaps means that I ought to hang my head in shame, but all that one can say is that what we do the best that we can. I may not be able to do the best that I can because nowadays I spend quite a lot of time lecturing on cruise ships, and one of the cardinal rules of lecturers is avoid like plague the first session after lunch, and also avoid trying to speak from a text, because the result is usually a resounding absence of attention. But nevertheless, David Le Breton tells us what to do, so we do it. I've found in my career that I spend a lot of time talking to people still, partly because as we grow older we lack an audience. And they are interested if you tell it how it was. So here we go. I suppose I'm one of the few people who've experienced both ends of the indirect rule spectrum. As the last British resident commissioner of the condominium of the New Hebrides, which was otherwise rightly known as the Pandemonium, we had to unravel a situation where there were two direct rulers, the British and the French, but where the local inhabitants were constitutionally so far from governing themselves that they didn't possess even a nationality of their own, for French and French or British nationality either, but were technically stateless. By contrast, in my HMOCS days, I was brought up and worked in the Uganda Protectorate, where the basic constitution was derived from the Uganda Agreement of 1900 between Britain and the Kabaka and people of Uganda, which took the form almost of a Soviet treaty of friendship and cooperation, so that everybody knew who called the shots, but the saraband, as I've called it, of friendly advice and guidance was sustained. If I had to choose between the two systems, I would go for the Protectorate every time. I suppose there were three reasons why Uganda was a protectorate, while Kenya, I can't escape it, I still call it Kenya, do you? Yeah. Okay, Kenya, apart from Mombasa, was a colony. The first was that when the Speaker Grant reached what became Uganda, from the south of Lake Victoria, they found 4 African kingdoms already in place, including Karagwe, which in what is now Tanganyika, Tanzania, but excluding Toro, which was a later British creation. The greatest of these kingdoms was Kabaka Mutesa's Buganda, which so impressed even the old imperialist Winston Churchill that he described it in glowing terms. Quote, "Under a dynastic king with a parliament and a powerful feudal system, an amiable, clothed, polite and intelligent race dwell together under an organized monarchy." Pretty patronizing, but nevertheless quite admiring. The second reason was the appointment of Lord Lugard as the military governor of Uganda in 1890. He was, of course, brought up in India, where the princely states under British supervision outnumbered the directly governed areas of British India. And Lugard developed in Uganda the theories of indirect rule, which he later applied in Nigeria and described in the dual mandate in tropical Africa. Confronted with the reality of Buganda and the other kingdoms, it must have seemed only natural for him, and cheaper too, to seek to base his administration as far as possible on existing constitutional forms and institutions. The Buganda Agreement of 1900 was signed 8 years after Lugard's own departure, but it could just as well have been drafted by him. The third reason for the protectorate was that, unlike Kenya, there was never a meaningful number of white settlers in Uganda. The only time when outside settlement was seriously proposed was in 1903, when it was weirdly suggested that a Jewish national home should be established in what was then part of Uganda, later transferred to Kenya. Early politics in Kenya is mainly a story of strained relations between the settlers and the colonial government. There, the local inhabitants scarcely counted, but Uganda was different. The 1900 Buganda Agreement also had three limbs to it. First, it established the Kabaka and his government as the administrative rulers of the central province of Buganda. Second, it created the office of a British resident, whose principal duty was to advise the Kabaka's government. And third, it created a formal structure of land ownership under the Milo system, by which the land of Buganda was divided into two parts, one half of which was designated as Crown land, and the other half distributed as private estates among the Kabaka chiefs and great families of Buganda. This last, incidentally, was the source of endless trouble throughout the colonial period, as the Baganda were canny enough to grab the best land and to leave the swamps and forests to the British. It also largely ignored the customary rights of the clan leaders, the Bataka, the people of the land, who found themselves suddenly dispossessed by the court toadies around Mutesa. Nevertheless, the agreement provided a fairly stable and acceptable framework for the administration of Buganda for over 50 years, until Sir Andrew Cohen, the great elephant, chose to exile the Kabaka on the grounds that he wasn't fulfilling his duty under the agreement. This had an unhappy sequel after only 2 years, when a civil disobedience movement by virtually the whole of Buganda persuaded the colonial government to give way and let the Kabaka return on more or less his own terms. Personally, I was working in the resident Buganda's office at the time, having, despite my protests, been sent for from upcountry on the ground that my father, the former bishop of Uganda, was known to be sympathetic to the Buganda nationalists, and it was hoped that some of his popularity would rub off onto me. If that was the hope, it was vain. The resident and his staff tried to carry on much as before, touring the Buganda countryside, advising the chiefs and people, and encouraging agriculture, schools, hospitals, councils, corporations, courts, communal work, which was known as Bulungi Wansi, for the good of the country, and so on. But we found that the rest houses where we had stayed had mysteriously burned to the ground, that the chiefs were absent on important business, that the hens had apparently ceased to lay eggs, and the forest to produce firewood. All of this didn't matter much, but it was an illustration of the fact that indirect rule, once established, is difficult to reverse. It also had longer-term and disastrous effects on the fortunes of the Kingdom of Buganda after independence. The Kabaka and his ministers had concluded that if they stood firm, the central government, whether British or Ugandan, would have to give way. When, therefore, after independence, they were in dispute with the governments of Obote and subsequently of Amin, the Baganda told them and their administrations to remove themselves from the territory of Buganda, which would henceforward be independent. But Obote and Amin were not the British, and the Baganda had no force to back up their ultimatums. The only result of this, therefore, was to re-exile and subsequent death of Kabaka Mutesa II, the abolition of the Buganda Kingdom, the centralization of all government under the dictators, and the death of untold numbers of both Baganda and the members of other tribes. My conclusion, therefore, is that indirect rule worked reasonably well during the colonial period, at least in Buganda, but that it proved a chimera after independence under more ruthless leaders to whom the concept of checks and balances was unknown. Had there been time, I would have liked to have gone on to describe the oddities of double indirect rule in other parts of Uganda, under which tribes like the Bagisu found themselves administered not by themselves or by the British, but by carpet-bagging Baganda agents like Seme Kakunguru, who acted, albeit under the authority of the British, like colonialists in adjoining parts of their own country. Indirect rule also undoubtedly had a pernicious effect in misleading the many tribes of Uganda into the belief that central control would wither away after the British departed, leaving at most a federal system behind them. In the last years of the Protectorate, the misguided luminaries of the Wild Commission advised that the way to practice the principle of the people of Uganda in the ways of independence was to devolve as much authority as possible onto the individual districts, which were named after and largely coincided with tribal boundaries. In other words, they aimed to imply the transfer of whatever vestiges of indirect rule from the centre might remain. This led the districts not unnaturally to conclude that independence would mean the withering away of central government altogether, leaving each tribe standing proud in their own cabbage patch. In the area where I was then working, this was symbolised by the growing habit of referring to the district administration as Governmenti Eafwe, meaning our government, and the central government as Governmenti Engereza, which means the British government. I protested that this was sending the wrong signals, and I have my own written submissions in my files to prove it, but I was too far down the food chain for anyone to listen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Now let's jump across Lake Victoria and down through Tanganyika, Tanzania, into northern Rhodesia. And David, Salmon, thank you.
I'm very conscious of the fact that I have a rather quiet and indistinct voice. If I do begin to speak too quickly or inaudibly, I hope those at the back will feel free to warn me by heckling. I spent some 9 years in the administration of northern Rhodesia and Zambia. I went out to Barotseland in northern Rhodesia, a callow 24-year-old cadet in the administration direct from Cambridge in 1959. Indirect rule had been in operation for rather less than 30 years. Independence was only 5 years away. Indirect rule, therefore, had a comparatively short period in North Rhodesia. It was applied unevenly throughout the country. Barotseland, now the western province of Zambia, was the only one of the 8 provinces where there was a single native authority covering the whole area. It was referred to as the Barotse native government, whereas elsewhere, each province, and indeed often individual districts, had several different native authorities with different levels of effectiveness. The British government took over responsibility for the administration of Northern Rhodesia on the 1st of April 1924. It had previously been controlled by the British South Africa Company, which had negotiated an agreement with the Barotse paramount chief in the 1890s. The other parts of the country had been brought under company control mainly, but not entirely, peacefully. The company ruled directly, largely ignoring the chiefs and headmen. The people of Barotseland, the Lozi, lived in the upper Zambezi Valley, and their paramount chief ruled them and the subject tribes living among them. In 1924, the Colonial Office confirmed the special position of the Barton government. In 1927, the second governor of Northern Rhodesia, Sir James Maxwell, was transferred there from the Gold Coast, where he'd been imbued with the Lugard philosophy and ruled indirectly through traditional ruling hierarchies. New men replacing the old guard in the administration were also inspired by the indirect rule doctrine. On the 1st of April 1930, the Native Authority Ordinance and the Native Courts Ordinance came into force. The ordinances empowered a chief designated as a native authority to issue rules and orders for his tribe and to enforce them, together with certain territorial laws in the native court. In 1936, the Native Treasuries Ordinance gave native authorities the power to collect taxes and to spend some of the money collected. They were also allowed to appoint councillors with specific functions. From the first, there were problems in implementing the policy. By the 1930s, European settlement had taken place in the new mining towns of the Commonwealth, and the limited areas allocated by the colonial government for white farmers along the line of rail from the southern Rhodesia border through the centre of the country. Africans living in these areas were largely excluded from the influence of the native authorities. In some parts, it was difficult to find a traditional ruling hierarchy. Tribes such as the southern province Tonga hardly knew what a chief was. An artificial structure had to be created. Where he existed, the hereditary chief, the main support of the scheme, was a decaying power. Even where he did exist, he was unlikely to be educated, and he was often unsuitable for this kind of responsibility. Most serious of all, the policy failed to recognise the reality of a growing industrial African society in the Copperbelt mining towns. There, the growing class of educated Africans resented the attempt to restore traditional tribal structures. Throughout the 1930s and into the war years, senior members of the administration clung to the theory that Africans' bases remained in the tribal areas. In 1937, the Provincial Commissioners' Conference agreed that there should be a compulsory repatriation of Africans from the Copperbelt after a maximum of 2 years to prevent detribalisation. However, it was too late to turn the clock back. The idea of bringing the native authority system into the towns was soon dropped. In 1938-9, urban native courts were introduced. During the war, urban advisory councils consisting of Africans appointed by the district commissioner were set up in most Commonwealth towns. This was an acceptance that a large proportion of the African population was now living outside the sphere of the native authority. The American historian Robert Rothberg said that, with the possible exception of Barotseland, indirect rule was never real. District commissioners resisted the imposition of power for fear that native authorities would perform their tasks inefficiently and incompetently. I think that's an exaggeration. While it may not have applied as clearly as in Nigeria, it did still have a fairly large part in Northern Rhodesia. In Barotseland, there was a traditional basis for the implementation of indirect rule. It was originally introduced to the whole of Northern Rhodesia except Barotseland, however. What Barotseland's special position was far from clear. There, the district officer had no power to interfere with native courts, and there was no precision over the respective spheres of jurisdiction of the white and black governments. Barotseland was excluded from the 1930 legislation. This anomaly was rectified in 1935, but whereas in the rest of Northern Rhodesia indirect rule gave more power to chiefs, in Barotseland it effectively brought them under firmer control of the central government. Inevitably, there was a stronger, more formal framework of government in Barotseland. It had changed little by the time I arrived there in 1959. The paramount chief and his council governed from their headquarters in Leolui. Under them, each district had its own chief, and its term was divided into a dozen or more sections, each with their own sub-chiefs. Their functions were, however, essentially the same as in the rest of the country. They were responsible for revenue raising by way of tax collection, court fees and licensing. They were responsible for law and order in their areas. Their courts had civil and criminal jurisdiction, although in most areas their work was predominantly civil. The role of the district officer was to supervise and advise. Much of this was done by touring the area on foot in company with the local chiefs. The aim was to visit every village once a year. I wrote home in September 1959 that I'd spent 35 out of my first 67 nights in Colombo on the Angola border, out of the bush under canvas. At my first tour I wrote, "We're touring Sea Chicago, one of the 15 administrative areas of Colombo. I have 21 carriers, 3 messengers, 1 coop, plus 3 Indunas and a call clock. We should walk about 150 miles. At each camp, the villagers come down and I take a census. I then check on their taxes and attempt to make them pay up to the native treasury. I then listen to any complaints, answer any questions and give advice. Nobody asks for my qualifications as an advice giver. Departmental councillors were introduced to the fields of agriculture, education and health, but in Barton there was little development. What there was undertaken by the central government. It took responsibility for schools, hospitals, roads and serious crime. Although even in these areas it sought the cooperation of the native authority. Much of my first 6 months was taken up with building a 40-mile canal. Part of my responsibility in my invitation of James Brindley was to persuade the Induna later, the leader of the Colombo Council, of the value of the enterprise. The support of the native authority was considered crucial for its success. In the other parts of the country, the effectiveness of the councils varied greatly depending on the strength of the authority. In my second tour I went to Fort Jameson in the Eastern Province. Then I was responsible for the ICwS native authority. An enlightened paramount chief Undi could ensure that able and educated people were recruited as councillors, and they were able to work effectively with central governments. In other areas, such as the northwest, this was not the case. How effective was indirect rule? It has been fashionable to look on indirect rule as the colonial government's means of offloading work and responsibility onto native authorities, who were little more than their stooges. It is true that in northern Rhodesia there was considerable overlapping between central government and native authorities, and regular interference by district commissioners in matters such as the appointment of chiefs. The more effective chiefs did, however, exercise a considerable amount of influence. When the Central African Federation was imposed on Northern Rhodesia in 1953, it was pressure from the chiefs in a crucial area which persuaded the British government that control of the police and courts should remain territorial rather than a federal responsibility. Many of the chiefs saw the rising influence of the nationalist parties as a threat to their own position. Some of the more enlightened saw it as an opportunity to retain their influence. Undi joined the ANC at an early date, and when UNIP became the leading nationalist party, he rapidly transferred his allegiance. UNIP recognised that men such as him had an importance in their own rights, and not merely through the colonial government. They went to some pains to court in the years leading up to independence. Indirect rule was used as a way of getting the country administered on the cheap, and its effectiveness was variable. Native authorities were, however, far more than stooges. They showed their independence in various ways. Orders which were generally unpopular, such as those relating to village cleanliness or proscribing cultivation in certain areas, were not enforced. Unpopular taxes such as dog licenses were not collected. Indirect rule did work to a large extent, but not merely on the terms of the central government. The native authorities ensured that it was marked with their own imprint, as well as that of the Europeans. Indirect rule meant that in the areas of daily life most important to the people, it was left to the traditional rulers to interpret customs, local customs and justice, and administrators kept their interference in these areas to a minimum.
Thank you very much, David. Now let's go to John Barton.
Right, Tanganyika, 1952 to 61, 9 years, the last 3 of them district commissioner, and that was the end of that particular career. I mentioned the British Council earlier. I was serving with the British Council in Malaysia 10 years later, when I received an invitation from the government of Tanzania to return to the country for their 10th anniversary of independence celebrations. along with about 150 others. Almost a decade later, I was nominated to be the British Council Director, Tanzania. This was cleared with the Tanzanian authorities, Foreign Office and so on. But in the event I didn't go because for extraneous personnel reasons I was posted elsewhere. I mention these two things simply to indicate that there was clearly no recrimination at work here. I've been welcomed back to the celebrations, and I've been accepted as a British Council representative in a former colonial country. So we must be doing something right. Indirect rule, right or wrong, is perhaps the wrong question, implying as it does an element of morality. Do we inquire of our form of local government whether it is right or wrong? No. As with indirect rule, what matters is whether it works, meets a need, and is more or less fair. In Tanganyika, it worked with variable success. It also had its faults and limitations. Now, my own contribution is less a description and a history and more of a critique. Now, historically, indirect rule is, in one form or another, is as old as empires. As practiced by us, it represented an expedient, economical, and pretty effective way of conducting local government. Sir Donald Cameron, disciple of Lugard and governor of Tanganyika from 1925 to 31, clothed it in a mantle of high principle. I quote a fragmentary extract from his memorandum on the subject. We cannot discharge our obligation under the mandate if we do not train the people to administer their own affairs. The wise and practical course is to build on the tribal institutions which have been handed down through the centuries. It is our duty to develop the native politically on lines suitable to the state of society in which he lives. It is essential that the government rules through these institutions, which are to be regarded as an integral part of the machinery of government, with well-defined powers and functions recognised by law and not dependent on the caprice of an executive officer, i.e. the district officer. The institutions referred to were chiefs, chiefs in council, sub-chiefs, and so on. Now, at the time I did my Devonshire course in 1951-2, Cameron's model of indirect rule featured in the curriculum, but it wasn't drilled into us as wholly writ, but rather taken for granted as being a good thing, notwithstanding Creech Jones's memorandum of 5 years earlier, which was referred to this morning. Even in the field, the starry-eyed and uncritical cadet could see that whilst the system worked, and at its best it worked well, it was not one which, unreformed, was likely to meet the requirements of a modern nation state. Though to be fair, it seemed that this would not be for many years to come. Cameron's purpose was admirable, and indirect rule probably a better way than any other of introducing an unsophisticated and disparate peasantry in the aftermath of the First World War and warring armies trampling across it, introducing the peasantry to a territory-wide structure of local government. But it should perhaps have been regarded as an interim means to an end, and in no way an end in itself. As it was, it became ossified in varying degrees, and its credibility gradually waned as it failed to meet the requirements of a slowly evolving society and a rapidly evolving politics, especially after the Second World War. I go on to identify at least some of its weaknesses as I saw them, and still do. Indirect rule was based on the traditions of backward-looking conservative communities which perceived the future as a simple extension of the past. thus inhibiting other elements of the doctrine to build on, to develop the native politically, and so on. It tended to reinforce tribal differences in custom and law, not desirable features in a unified nation state. In practice, we never saw tribalism as being a threat to the nation state. It was fairly low-key in Tanganyika, if only because there was no one ethnic group which was sufficiently large to presume to want to dominate the rest. But Julius Nyerere did see tribalism as a potential threat. Indirect rule assumed the existence of tribal institutions based on the office of chief. A substantial minority of tribal groups did not have chiefs, so the Germans, and later we, created them. A departure from the ordained philosophy of building on tradition. Chiefs of both kinds could be good, poor, or indifferent, but whilst it was relatively easy to replace a non-traditional chief who was corrupt or incompetent, it could be difficult or impossible to remove a traditional one who, whatever his shortcomings, retained the loyalty of his people. Although paid from local revenues, native authorities as individuals were increasingly seen as agents of central government and correspondingly less as the leaders and representatives of their own people. They themselves, aware of their status, saw themselves as being protected by the central government, and those who were so inclined felt able to get away with petty corruption and oppression. The extent of this can't possibly be known, but where it did exist and went undetected or unpunished, it reflected on us and our government. Because of local differences in custom, the precise functioning of indirect rule varied from district to district, with further variations contingent on the personalities and dispositions of native authorities on one hand and the incumbent district commissioners on the other. One effect of the tribal basis of indirect rule was that native authorities invariably employed local people. At one extreme, the poor and backward district with a moribund native authority and a very limited pool of talent would have very low levels of public service, in which circumstances only the DC could effect any improvement and was therefore compelled to interfere. At the other extreme, in a more developed and prosperous district where education was valued, go-ahead native authorities would have access to considerable talent and could manage their affairs pretty well with very little intervention by the district commissioner, who would typically be invited to attend council meetings as a matter of courtesy rather than as a necessity. In the first example, indirect rule was a failure. In the second, a success. These weaknesses, and no doubt others, limited the extent to which indirect rule could be modernised or reformed. The changes which took place in the 1950s derived, I think, from applied pragmatism rather than theory or principle. Thus, district councils came into being, initially advisory and with nominated councillors, usually with the DC as chairman. But towards the end of the decade, the typical district council was elected, had executive powers, and was chaired by one of the councillors, quite possibly a respected chief, but not necessarily. The old NAs continued to exist, but in most cases, local power had shifted from chiefdoms to district councils by the end of the decade. No chiefs retained their judicial functions except where there was a locally based magistracy. There were ironic twists in the tale. First, in the mid-1950s, government mistakenly promoted native authorities as bulwarks against the advance of nationalist politics. Not quite the kiss of death, but pretty close. Second, the more receptive, and latterly virtually all, native authorities climbed onto the nationalist Talu bandwagon, Tanganyika African National Union, either from conviction or expediency. Third, native authorities were abolished by the Talu government 3 or 4 years after independence. Fortunately, the machinery for carrying out the functions of local government remained. The administrative and technical staff of district and native authority councils. The power and decision-making shifted from the native authorities, councils, and us to party apparatchiks. Now that's about it. This is by no means comprehensive, and like all generalizations, suffers from oversimplification and omission. But it's basically how I saw it at ground level. By way of a PS, I'd just like to contrast the relative sclerosis of indirect rule in the later days of colonial rule with the adaptability of central government, where from the inception of the Legislative Council, incremental constitutional development was not only possible but inevitable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I just sum up some of the ideas that have been presented to us? First of all, we were told that native administration as it was established was expedient, economical and effective. And I think it's quite an important thing to bear in mind. Here are people applying ideas on the hoof in territories where they do not necessarily have a terribly sure foothold. And certainly not a lot of precedence about where it's all going to go. It did seem for many people, after all they're still recruiting people for the colonial service when I left university, with the promise that this was a job for life. And some of you may have experienced that. We're also being told to think about native administration, how it was. But of course that raises questions of when and where. And most of us know about the latter years of colonial rule. That's our experience by our very ages. And that's very different from the earlier and mid-years of colonial rule. So I think we need to be a bit cautious about where we're actually talking about. And that raises questions about native administration differing from territory to territory. The whole question of periodisation is very important, I think, in this. So is the diversity, the regionalism, the great variety, the way in which native administration was unevenly applied, as we were told, for example, by David in northern Rhodesia. It may have been practical administrative politics, but does it also act as a brake on education, economic development, and ideas of modernity? Now, all of that, of course, has to be placed within the context of what people at the time who had access to the levers of power were actually thinking. And it's all very well to sit here and say, well, they should have been thinking in these terms. But that's being unhistorical, and it's not being terribly helpful, I think. The third point, and something which has been referred to, but I don't think it's really been unpacked and looked at as perhaps we should look at it, and we don't want to lose sight of this. And this is the rise of what are often referred to as nationalist parties. Increasingly refer to them as patriot parties rather than nationalist political parties. They are opposed by indigenous rulers over quite a large part of Africa. For example, the National Liberation Movement in Ashanti is not for liberation from Britain, it's from liberation from being dominated by Nkrumah's Convention People's Party. And it was an aspect of Ashanti politics. And that's not the only example. There are many examples like that of politics within the latter period of so-called nationalist politics, where the politics are in fact are anti-nationalist or they're sub-nationalist. And of course they bring with them something else that Andrew referred to, and that is the sub-colonialism or sub-imperialism that some of the that native administration encouraged, inadvertently, perhaps maybe advertently, as a means of controlling areas of Africa. Decolonisation, as we all know, was a fairly hurried process. Few people in 1950 would have thought that in 15 years' time, much of Africa would have been independent. Reasons for that has got less to do, I think, with nationalism, so-called in Africa, much more to do with the ambitions of governments in London and where they saw their future lay in a global world, particularly in relation to Europe and so on. Local government, we've heard a lot about the 1947 local government memorandum. That is only very, very slowly introduced, and there are areas of Africa where it has hardly been introduced at all as independence is ushered in. And what does take the place of the colonial state, however we define it, with its vagaries and its differences under native administration and a system of local government which is coming in, is a territorial state based primarily on the frontiers of the colonial state itself. So in a way it's an artificial structure, which is one of the big problems that African rulers face as they take over as the inheritors of the colonial rulers. Well, if you would like to make a comment, please do. Can you please give your name first? I repeat, please can you give your name first, and then we'll proceed from there. So, I have one letter. Thank you.
Hubert Allen. I served in Uganda, having been brought up in East Africa. In what was then Tanganyika and school in Kenya. And then subsequently working in northern Nigeria during the Civil War in the Institute of Administration. And after that, Director of Training for the International Union of Local Authorities. And I have spoken to some of you earlier, or would have spoken if I hadn't been ill, about local government in the dependent territories. A thing that I feel that David Salmon touched on it, but I think needs to have much greater emphasis, is the disparity of within countries. And Uganda was a stark example of that. The artificiality of the boundaries imposed by the Berlin, or whatever it was, the scramble for Africa, reaches a sort of peak in Uganda. The Nilo-Hamitic peoples of the north and the Nilotic peoples of the east are as far removed in culture and language, everything else, from the peoples of Buganda and the kingdoms of the West, as we are from Turkey. It's a totally different, it's not just, it's ethnic, it's linguistic, everything is different. And particularly they are nomadic peoples, family-based, with no tradition of any sort of centralizing chieftains in most cases. These were artificially largely created by the British in order to establish something on which you could build indirect rule. I think that aspect needs to be borne in mind very much. But some areas, I think even in Tanzania and Maasai, but certainly in Kenya and Uganda, you had this totally alien group for which indirect rule, as we understood anywhere else, was almost meaningless.
Thank you for that. Can we gather a few other comments and then we'll ask for them?
You remarked, Chairman,
can you give your name?
sorry, Jonathan Lawley,
Thank you, Jonathan.
9 years pre- and post-independence in Zambia. you rightly, in my opinion, talked about independence being a hurried process. I arrived back from leave at the beginning of 1964 in Northern Rhodesia and was sent off to the Luapula province, to Inchilengi sub-district as district officer in charge, where the very first local government elections ever were held. So the native authority had ended, the local council had started. The problem was it was now political, and the politicians had promised that if they were elected, they would ban all taxes. They'd also promised they promised that they would ban not just the Lumpa Church, but also the Jehovah's Witnesses, because they didn't like the Jehovah's Witnesses going around preaching house to house, because the Jehovah's Witnesses didn't go with the UNIT party. They then, having got into power, they then banned all the taxes, but they also voted themselves huge salaries. Now, in this situation, it was really the helter-skelter towards independence was, in my opinion, to this day, really very irresponsible. But HMG was determined to go down that route. I found myself, as the last British district officer in charge at Inchilengi, with this massive task of trying to talk the local authority out of its policies and trying to get them to pass a budget. Anyway, so that's on the one hand. On the other hand, Mr. Chairman, you can say, well, we went down that route in Northern Rhodesia. The country was bound to make all sorts of mistakes. Some sort of a timetable wouldn't have been practical. Therefore, it made some sense that they should be allowed to make their own mistakes. And I think, having recently been in Zambia and been in touch with the country ever since independence, right up to about 3 months ago we were there, it's a country which has learned from its mistakes. It is now a mature democracy, and I'm certainly not against indirect rule. I thought that at the time was absolutely the appropriate training ground, in a sense.
Thank you. John? No, yes.
Charles Cosmo. I was briefly a DO in Tanganyika from 58 to 61, and then very much later, 30 years later, I found myself, to be sort of coming full circle in an African way, High Commissioner in Uganda. That was in the early 90s. And just a couple of reflections, really sparked off by the discussion now and what the previous but one speaker said. I mean, I thought it all along, but I wasn't quite sure why. That indirect rule was a necessity. I can't quite see how it could have been done any other way. And perhaps that's not a point that's been made, so it's a bit academic, but it was right or wrong. It was the only way. Partly because of the resources available. The idea, for instance, in Tanganyika, that I think there were about 200, David will correct me if I'm wrong, David will reckon, 200 or 250 administration officers altogether for the whole country, that could somehow be done directly. I just don't know how that would have been feasible. But then that's just, but the second thought, which sparked off, yes. Yeah. Actually, perhaps in a sense, it was a good thing because there were these absolutely huge discrepancies, both obviously between African countries, but also within these artificial states, or these artificial territories that have been created out of Berlin and Congress. And huge ethnic differences. Uganda is a case in point, as I well know. And yet, during the period of British rule, if you leave aside Mau, which was about land, actually, mainly, and later Zimbabwe, the situation within these artificial constructs was basically peaceful. And it could well be that that was partly because, on the whole, out of necessity, partly, I guess we were ruling with a very light touch, which allowed for huge differences in the way different districts of different regions, the difference in northern Nigeria being particularly stark, they were able to carry on more or less as they had done before. Okay, the downside of that is what they did do for development, but at least it meant that peace was maintained, whereas subsequently since independence, well, one only has to look at all the instability and the conflict there's been very often within African states. Maybe partly because they're now required to be subjected to direct central rule.
Thank you. Yes.
My name is Bill Clarence. I was a cadet and junior BBC in Uganda from 56 to 62. And I'd also, in a later life, I was a United Nations official working in Rwanda. First, my experience of indirect rule was in the Kingdom of Tora, indirect rule at the district level of the Commonwealth.
Can you speak up, please?
Sorry. My experience in Uganda was of indirect rule was in the Kingdom of Tora, on the mountains of the moon, a small Hamitic kingdom which had the same sort of structure as political structure and hierarchy as Uganda, but much less power. Now, on the whole, it worked quite well. Indirect rule worked quite well in Tora. Why? I think largely because the provincial administration had more direct financial control, and also the district officers were monitoring events and touring in the district. But also, I think it must be said that it worked much better in Tora than it did in, for example, Uganda, because of the character of the Mukama himself. The Mukama himself was a delightful person, very colourful and genial character, but he did not have a political sense. He was not. He wanted wealth for himself and his court, but in terms of politics, he was not so. He didn't really have political ambitions in the same way that one would expect. For example, Mutesa. Now, what I saw 40 years later, I saw. I was working in the context of UN peacekeeping operations in immediate post-genocide Rwanda. Now, in that particular situation, you had African troops from many different African countries. I remember particularly Zimbabwe. And the Rwandans put on a display of dancing, etc., and traditional Tutsi dancing, which is very beautiful. And this had an immense effect on people like the Zimbabweans, who said that they'd never seen anything like this before, and how very much they admired what the Rwandan culture, that they managed to keep their culture. Well, that is maybe true, but Rwanda itself was excuse me, was itself a result, a rather disastrous result of indirect rule. Rwanda was an absolute ruler up until just before independence, and after that the Tutsi rulers were massacred in Barton, and most of them went off to Rwanda and other places. So I would say, I don't see you can say indirect rule right or wrong. I think you can say that it's rather, indirect rule is rather the conundrum of benevolent colonialism. It's obviously very important for Africans to have respect and culture maintained. But if you have such a system, it makes progressive policies problematic, and the transfer of power, ultimate transfer of power often in near disasters.
Thank you very much. Well, let's have some responses. Andrew.
Yes, I agree about the Mukama of Toru. Splendid fellow. He never paid his bill in the local hotel, but apart from that, he was great. Just two issues, if I might. First of all, this issue of the fact that the ethnic divisions of Africa were vital, actually, in the history of not only the colonial period but thereafter. When people ask me what we did wrong in Africa, I usually say that unlike the cliche of colonial economic, cultural, religious exploitation, I think the two big errors that we made were to be insufficiently sensitive in our pursuit of the creation of nation states in Africa. It was unfortunate that the colonies were created at the time when in Europe the nation state had become sacrosanct. We're a bit wiser now because we've gone through the Bosnian conflict and all that. We understand a bit more about ethnicity than we did in those days. And it is undoubtedly true that many of the subsequent problems of Africa have been the insensitivity of those who drew the colonial boundaries. There's no doubt about it. In Uganda, it has led to this seesaw where you're either up or you're down. And if you're down, you try to get up and vice versa. And that has had a very unfortunate effect, not only in Uganda, of course, but if you take Zimbabwe, if you take Nigeria, if you take Kenya, all those countries have been saddled with inexcusable colonial boundaries by us. The supreme example, perhaps, is the fact that Kilimanjaro was given to Kaiser Wilhelm by his grandmother, Queen Victoria, as a birthday present. And that is symbolic, if you like, of the way that we treated these things. The second, and there's no doubt about it, that the inequality not only of economic development, but of cultural differences has had a disastrous effect throughout Africa. And the other thing which is complementing the same thing is the fact that certainly in Uganda we didn't do anything really about the political education of the army. Hence you got not only the tribal differences that led to the Obote, Amin, Museveni split in Uganda, you got the fact that the army were not under control. So I agree with you, but I think that was a failure of imagination, if you like, of the original colonial settlement. The second thing I'd like to do, Chairman, if I may, is to comment on your remark, which is perfectly true, that we didn't talk at all about the nationalist political parties. You know, if we had another thing on another meeting on the impact of the relationship between tribal rulers and tribal customs and new political parties coming to take over, you know, great, I'd welcome that. The fact is, that, of course, that the political parties were the great enemies of indirect rule. They weren't interested in partial tribal powers. They wanted uncontrolled development power in their own hands. And that, again, I think we kind of shunned the nationalists earlier on. Do you remember? We preferred to deal with the tribal authorities with whom we were familiar. So, yeah, I agree with you.
Okay. Well, I've got it in somehow. Okay. Go on, David, would you?
I think, yes, The point about the boundary is obviously a very important one. In northern Rhodesia, the boundary cuts the Lunda tribe in half. And, so Balabali district had part of the Lunda tribe, part of the Bali. The Lundas, majority were in the Congo. That obviously meant that when it came to local authorities in Balabali after independence, we've got two truncated native authorities going to work together, and one, in fact, was virtually subject after the other, and it just was impossible. Because that goes on to the point about the disparities between the local authorities, the native authorities. They were artificial in some cases, in other cases they weren't so artificial, they actually did represent the full tribe. Where they were artificial, they were usually weaker. When in Barotseland, which was the one really genuine large entity, even there the boundaries were very vague. The Paramount Chief's claims were outrageous. He claimed to have control of the copper belt, and part of the problems of Zambia continued after that was the British South African companies' claims to royalties from the copper belt, which had been given them by Manawina in Barotseland. We've got no right whatsoever to do so. Of course, the strength of the local authorities as well varied so much. John talks about Chilenge, the local authority there, doing away with taxes. At the same time, the Chewa, their first elected district council in 1964, before independence, the local politicians had been telling people for the previous year or two they'd stop paying taxes at independence. But I remember sitting on the first Chewa elected council, and they said, well, of course we said that at the time, but it's obviously nonsense. We'll fix a tax straight away. And they fixed a much lower tax for the villager, but they made a graded tax. So, I mean, they'd learned the lesson before they came to power. So, again, I think it just shows the difference of the local native authorities throughout the country.
Tom, a few disparate comments. Earlier on, I referred to the localisation of indirect rule in Tanganyika, with some districts being well served and others being badly served. And on the 10th anniversary of independence, Jamboree, we learned that one thing that the post-independence government had done was to introduce a unified local government service which catered for transferability of local government staff all over the country. If we had attempted to institute that particular reform, and I don't think we ever had it in mind, but if we had done, we'd have been jumped on from a great height by Tana, another example of colonial meddling. And I think there had been, in the interim, an improvement in this respect, but only a partial improvement, because the more able and talented and trusting local government employees tended to gravitate to the more sophisticated and more prosperous districts anyway. They didn't apply for jobs in the backwoods, and some of the backwards districts continued to languish for that reason. But like I say, that there had been some improvement. I do feel that if we had been less wedded to the notion of indirect rule earlier, and had started moving pretty swiftly towards district councils rather than chieftain councils, soon after the Second World War, instead of the 50s, there would have been a well-established system of district council, functioning district councils, which had bedded in over a period of a decade or so, and which would have removed some of the hesitation that Julius Nyerere and his party had over what they were inheriting. I mean, at the time, your average Tanganyikan in the bush didn't travel a lot. Some did, but most didn't. Their interests were bounded by the chieftain or even sub-chieftain, and there could be 2, 3, sometimes 4 chieftains in one district. Even a district was an alien concept to most of them. So if this process of local government development had begun earlier, we would have seen results by the time of independence. Boundaries, we hear a lot about this. And the critics of imposed colonial boundaries are absolutely right. And yet, most boundaries anywhere have been imposed by the powerful upon the powerless, wherever it is. In the case of Africa, it was probably easy to disregard local susceptibilities because many of the areas through which these straight lines were drawn were relatively unpopulated, so that at the time there would be little or no dispute, and government would be a long way away, and nobody probably cared very much about it. The faults have shown up since. And although I can understand why, back in the early 60s, the Organisation of African Unity resolved to retain the colonial boundaries, I've never understood why it was impossible for them to abandon Amour propre and negotiate over some of the anomalies. They could have done so without any loss of face internationally.
Could I just say that I think the reason they weren't prepared to negotiate was that they realised that once you start breaking up the countries, they'd all break up. I think that was the main problem with Biafra.
Now, I've got 2 questions, one there and one there. So could I take one first, please?
Thank you very much. Could I just say, having been Douglas Durand, 4 years under the protectorate government in Uganda, and 10 years under the Uganda government, under Obote, just left after the coup with Amin. Now, there's one factor mentioned with David Livingstone down in Botswana, but there would be no Uganda if there'd been no church and no CMS missionaries who went out there. The baby on the doorstep of 10 Downing Street was Uganda. Shall we take it in? There'd have been no Lord Lugard or indirect rule in Nigeria without the church going. Colin Stanley, there's no kingdom like there fit for Christianity to be taught. So that's each country that I've heard about and studied is different. If I could just say a word about independence in Uganda. I first heard about what was going to happen. I was told 20 years, went out in 1958. Then there was the wind of change. Ian Ramsey, do you remember? Wind of change, South Africa. So we all had to put the skates on. Independence came in 62. We weren't ready with no idea, but you had to do the best you could. Can I mention one real experience? There was a Jukite, a divisional chief up in Chole. I worked in Karamoja, cowboys and Indians chasing cattle. Chole, somewhere in between. West Nile, we getting it from the Lado enclave, the Belgians and the Sudanese. You can't do things now as you would have done in the scramble for Africa. And it's wrong to put those ideas now and say they should have done it this way. You can't do it in history. But this Jukite said to me, it was internal independence for both who came to power. I shall be far worse off under an independent African country than I will now. That was his comment. You telling me to tell these people. Now, the system of indirect government in northern Uganda was based on what David has what Andrew has told us about Buganda. We copied them. The Buganda sent their agents into Busoga and up into the north, and the model. But in every district I worked in, there was a local native council. There was an Agafumbi in West Nile who was some sort of leader. But where Western democracy does not work, and it's not working, is you cannot have an opposition. It doesn't work in Africa. You are either with the ruling party or against it. And if you're against it, heaven help you. I mean, it just does not work. Because that is not the culture and history of Africa, and that's part of the trouble. But just a word after, I worked for 10 years under the Uganda independent government. The great advantage and difference from being under the protectorate government, as an expatriate, I had no tribal wishes or prejudices. You could do within reason what was sensible and you were respected. And I've been back, I'm now a retired Anglican priest, and I was ordained after returning in 72. But the experience of going back to Uganda in 2000 and talking to the children of the people whose fathers I worked with, they said, what was it like? We don't know what it was like under Obote. We don't want these terrible wars that we had under Amin and afterwards under Okello and then Museveni. Well, that's a question I won't go into now. But they wanted to know, and they could not experience or believe that there had been such a peaceful existence in Uganda for 60 years. They asked me, what was it like? And they were said, please don't leave us alone. We want you to come and be part of us. We don't want to be left out in the cold, concentrating on Europe and the Far East. You were married. We were married in Uganda. And there's that tremendous bond of, I heard it said that Amin could never have carried on without the civil servants doing what they'd always done and the local authorities still doing what they'd somehow been taught to do. But I think it was an experience.
Let's take one more.
Thank you, Chair. My perspective in many ways is the same that has been voiced by the panel and some members here, but I come from the other side of the fence, in that I was never, in my experience, part of the colonial administration or representative from Britain. I was one of the people who had grown up locally. Be that as it may, I think the first point is this emphasis on indirect rule. The word indirect, as if there was an option to that. I think the rule that was implemented was born out of expediency, and what happened was the only solution to administer these territories. So there was no question of there being a direct rule. It would have been impossible. I don't even know what direct rule would have meant. Having said that, there were different models of rule that was established in different countries, but essentially they had the same underpinning, which was that the essential functionaries of the colonial administration, the district commissioners and their likes, were a special breed of men and women who came out with special qualities and a mission. Essentially, they implemented that, and that worked out by and large very well. But I hope there will be another opportunity to talk of that particular aspect. This issue on borders and boundaries of countries. You talked as if in 1878, people who were dividing Africa knew what was the borders of Maasai country and what were the borders of Turkana country and whatever else in Africa. Or what were the different borders of different tribes in West Africa. Who knew that? It was not possible. They did what was essentially expedient at that particular time, and that's the best they could do. The issue is, how far are the African countries themselves now independent, dealing with that issue? The issue is not there in African countries except in odd places, like Southern Sudan, for instance. There is no problem of borders between Uganda and Kenya, or between Kenya and Tanzania. There will be some Maasais who will live in Tanzania, and there will be plenty of Maasais who live in Kenya. And they're not asking for a Kurdistan in Africa. The issue is within the countries, that the countries have to acknowledge that there is tribe as an entity in these societies. For 50 years since independence, many of these countries have pretended as if this issue did not exist. Uganda went back to it when Obote was overthrown and the current administration came in and revised the constitution. The biggest issue in Uganda now is Federo. The Bugandans are not satisfied with their position in the political entity that has been created in Uganda.
Can we take it there? I think you've made a number of valid points. Let's just get the response.
Can I make just one more point to complete my issue? And in Kenya, more important, the post-independent constitution that was negotiated in Lancaster House was a very decentralized negotiation, but the emphasis was the entities, the tribes, the ethnic groups. Immediately, within 2 years, that was overturned, and we had a very centralized executive government. 50 years later, Kenya has gone back, not to exactly the Lancaster House model, but something very much akin to it, or closer to it, with 47 recognized entities in the country, and each entity has been given a lot of local autonomy.
Okay, point made. Thank you very much. Andrew, let's have some comment.
No, just one comment. Thank you for your kind remarks about the missionaries. My father was the head of the Anglican Church in Uganda for 25 years. Thank you. You want that guy with the day.
David.
I think I'd like to make 2 points. I think I'd take issue with the gentleman over there on the democracy in Africa point. I can only speak for Zambia, but in Zambia in 1972, after 8 years of independence, the Second Republic was declared. That was a one-party state. Currently believed that that was the way to run the country. We didn't want opposition. In 1991, the Third Republic came into being. The 1991 election was a fair election, as far as I could see. I was there as an observer. And Kaunda's party was murdered at the polls. The opposition got in. Kaunda is still there as a respected elder statesman in the country. Since then, we've had 3 or 4 elections. The latest one last year saw the government heavily defeated again, and a new president. No problems. I'm not saying it's all perfect. There's still tribal issues. There's still various iffy issues, but there is quite a good democracy in spite of that. I think the only other point I agree with the gentleman over there and the gentleman over there over the question, what alternative was there to direct rule? I don't think there was much. In fact, I think it fits in the historical context of the British Empire. It's arguably followed the traditions of British colonial policy. The concept of responsible local government and how best it might be achieved was at the heart of the dispute over American independence in the 18th century. And it was also one of the many issues of Indian history in the middle to late 19th century. I think indirect rule, I don't see an alternative, and it does seem to me to follow the whole tradition of the period.
Thank you. Don.
Well, no comment on anything that's been said recently.
Well, make us something.
I'm going to. Somebody referred to parliamentary democracy a moment ago. Tanganyika, Tanzania has had a rather unusual history in that respect, and for 30 odd years post-independence, Tanzania was a one-party state, and I think one-party states are too easily dismissed as being, by definition, anti-democratic. I think it is possible, although rare, to have a democratic one-party state. What is crucial is how that one party comports itself and to what extent it is informed by public opinion and public needs. It didn't seem to take Tanzania very far forward, although it gained a worldwide reputation for Julius Nyerere as an elder African statesman, and Tanzania avoided all the bloodshed that has been common in many other African countries. But for the last 15 years it's been a multi-party state. It almost might as well not be, because Tanu's successor, the Chama Mapinduzi, is still the governing party and looks set to remain so. So, multipartyism doesn't necessarily lead to alternations of government.
I say in support of that, when I lived in Tanzania in the mid-60s, the general election had taken place, and I think there were 150 seats contested, and one TANU member changed sides in the Mwanza constituency, so that when the final vote came in, there were 149 TANU members and one member of the loyal opposition. And Kibinji Hall was then, is that right?
Yes.
It was divided so that the loyal opposition sat on one side and the government sat on the other. You really had a ludicrous picture of a sort of imposed Westminster model in a country for which it was inappropriate. We have time for one. So,
could I just interrupt you, David, very briefly? You say an imposed Westminster type government, but it was something that they signed up to.
Oh, sure. Yes, I agree. Yes. Thank you for that.
Michael Shaw, DO in Tanganyika, and then much later on, 18 years on good governance in the Third World. What if I could challenge somebody during the tea interval to play God and with the benefit of all this accumulated hindsight over the last 50 odd years, redraw me a map of Africa with the countries that should have existed. Because, as Don said, countries exist for all sorts of peculiar reasons and external factors and so on. And I'm reminded that the longest straight line on the map, I think, is that between the United States of America and Canada, which is a particularly peculiar boundary, it seems to me. The world is full of these anomalies. And could somebody please redraw a map for me?
Andrew's volunteering, I think.
I'm not going to redraw the map, but I'm not asking for a redrawing of the boundaries. All I'm saying is that we should have been more sensitive to the issues of ethnicity, Aka tribalism, that we now begin to understand in Europe after Yugoslavia.
Who is we, and how should we have known at that time, and how should we have organised it with the South Africans and the Portuguese? And
I'll give you some of the papers I wrote at the time.
Perhaps you went back to 1880.
We were as well.
Perhaps we should go back and go out and read Norman Davis's, is it the book called Lost Kingdoms? Where he revisits the states in Europe. That's just Europe. Places like, I was going to say Pimlico, but I mean Burgundy. But it could have been Pimlico if Hollywood had had it, if Ealing Studios had had its way. There are numerous kingdoms. The Basques, Gaelic-speaking people, Irish-speaking people, the Welsh, the Manx, the Cornish, the Bretons.
I mean English.
Even then. Thank you very much. Can we...
My father was attached to the Somaliland Ethiopia Boundary Commission before the war. Second World War. The Kenya Ethiopian Boundary Commission after the war. He was a botanist, and it was an administrative convenience that he could put the plants there. Recently I received an email via one of my father's juniors in Kew. From a lady in New York who turned out to be the daughter of an Ethiopian official who was running the Ethiopian or Abyssinian side of affairs, right through, from that, with the exception of the Italian interregnum, from 1932 to 1950. And she's written his biography, which I believe has now been published. So it wasn't entirely European imposition. There were some Africans actively involved in joining that.
I remember examining a SEVAS PhD on the Cameroon port boundaries. The most gripping of subjects, but nevertheless, it was done methodically with markers, which often got buried and lost and had to be refound. Can we thank our speakers for what has been an interesting and fairly lively interaction? So thank you very much, gentlemen.